Precure's action is one of the best parts of the franchise. Fight scenes filled with glorious Sakuga grace our screens every Sunday. But why just anime? Why not make this a magical girl fighting game? Toei might never deliver, but I will. So let's make a Precure fighting game from scratch. One reason I can't see them doing this is the target demographic, and the show's hesitance to show the girls attacking each other. So here's the story to set this up. The fairies invite the Cures to a festival with a special jewel. The jewel is charged up by power, so they need to fight to fill it up. At first it's a friendly tournament, but then villains show up and they want the jewel too. It's not a lot, but if the Cures need to fight, we can just say it's brainwashing. The show seems to love doing that, so let's just get that out of the way. As a fighting game fan, I have lots of nostalgia for the series, Marvel vs. Capcom and Smash Bros, so those will be our main inspirations. We can't have every Cure, but we will try and represent different series and combat styles. This video is partly inspired by the Build the Roster videos that fill up fighting game rosters with characters. Once again, there's a million Precure characters, so our starting roster will be 16. We don't have time for all of my favorites or all of yours, so let me know who you would have added. Spoiler warning for every season. With that said, let's get right into building the roster. The originals just have to be here because they literally started the show. They'd use lots of physical combat with punches and kicks. Their fighting style would also be pretty overwhelming since they'd play like the Ice Climbers. Their finishers include Marble Screw Max, and their third finisher would be Extreme Luminario, where Hikari would show up in the background to assist their attack. I didn't watch Max hard, so that's all I've got. Speaking of physical combat, another great brawler in the show is Rosetta is a shy, timid girl with a background in martial arts and a big green shield. I feel like the contrast between her personality and fighting style would be pretty entertaining to watch. I did consider Sunshine, but only Rosetta actually uses her shield like a weapon. Rosetta would be a pretty fast rushdown character with a lot of fast, small damage moves and a very aggressive playstyle. She'd start the match by saying, "If the villains are here, I'll give it my all," to justify why she's using her martial arts skills after swearing off them following an incident in her childhood. Her first finisher would be the classic, iconic Rosetta Wall, which she'd use too. The second finisher would let her summon her Rosetta Balloon, which would randomly call on one of her teammates to do a quick attack. Heart would shoot an arrow, Diamond would shoot ice, and Sword would shoot swords. Finally, her last finisher would involve the giant lance from the finale, doing a really big swoop. It takes up a lot of the screen, so it's pretty hard to dodge, but I'm sure they could balance it somehow. The third Cure I'd love to see be a physical fighter is The third Cure I'd love to see also fights physically, but this time mostly with her legs. The green athlete was a must pick for some green representation, but also how cool her combat was. March is incredibly strong. She'd be a mid to long range attacker with her kicks and air balls. Now would also be pretty fast, making her hard to deal with. Perhaps she could play like Zero Suit Samus. Her first finisher would be March Shoot, but her next one would be March Shoot Impact, where her siblings appear on screen to cheer her on. March's final finisher would be original, but would still take advantage of the princess form. She would summon 3 rotating cyclones, and they'd float across the screen. I thought she deserved her own fighting move since Smile didn't give the girl sub-attacks, and this is, creative enough that I'm satisfied with it. So now I've got 3 hand-to-hand combatants, and they're all Cures, so what about the villains? Siren would be our first villain in the roster and our sweet representation. I feel she's a fun trickster that could really shake up the game. She'd have a few cat scratches and sound attacks, but her finishers are where it gets interesting. Using her villain form, she could be a pretty annoying character to face. Her first finisher would allow her to transform into her cat form and do a bunch of cat scratches to alert her opponent. Her second finisher though would take advantage of her shape-shifting powers. In this one, she'd shape-shift into her opponent and use their own attack on them. Finally, her third attack lets her summon all the notes and complete the Melody of Sorrow. This song would leave the foe in despair for a certain amount of time. These seconds would let her attack without drawbacks and be just a little broken. I love Siren a lot and Sweet Precure a lot, so I thought I'd give her one of the more gimmickier / broken movesets. Let the game devs balance that. Moving on, let's add some other villains. Northa was a really cunning villain who struck fear into our hearts. She's always one step ahead of our heroines and has really creepy abilities. Northa would primarily attack with her vines and be a bit of a zoner / glass cannon. She'd attack from afar, and while her moves do a lot of damage, she can't quite take a hit. Her first attack would let her shoot energy blasts like she does in the anime, but the second would let her plant a seed that drains the opponent's health and restores her own. The third attack would let her transform into the dragon fusion from the anime. I love her a lot, so I'm glad I could find a place for her in this game. I also feel that we do need a few zoners because we can't have everyone fighting up close and personal. The third and final villain we're gonna add for now is one of the most haunting and popular characters in Precure history. Joker just had to be in the game. He's a force to be reckoned with and would be one of the stronger characters. He's a bit of a trickster like the other villains, mainly throwing cards or juggling balls while teleporting across the field. Joker would be slightly balanced by having lower HP maybe. His first finisher covers the screen in black ink while he attacks the opponent. His second finisher would allow him to transform into the Hyper Akanbe form that he fought Cure Beauty in. This would be permanent. It hits a lot harder, and because of this, I wouldn't give him a third finisher. To switch back, just press the special button and lose 1 bar of meter. I feel that that would balance giving him a brand new form with different attacks. He'd be able to reflect damage and stab with that giant lance. I think it would be a pretty fun character. So there's 3 villains added for the dark-sided Among Us, and now we're back to the cures. So far all the cures have fought physically, so let's add a few elemental fighters. Cure Fortune is one of my favorite singers, and aesthetically, I love her a lot. Fortune does martial arts, but as a Precure, she mostly uses star-themed attacks. Since Happiness Charge let the girls make their own attacks, Fortune's move pool is practically full. She can shoot stars on their own, make star rings, and even infuse them with lightning. She'd have a few light physical attacks, but mostly just use the stars. For Fortune's finishers, we're going to start with Fortune's Star Burst. Her second finisher uses the Amitsu Komachi form to perform Sakura Blizzard Dance. This is because I prefer it to the other one. Her third and final attack would awaken her innocent form for Emerald Illusion. All her attacks use a different form and are pretty visually appealing. I feel this represents Happiness Charge pretty well, and should be a very flashy character to see in play. Since we've got a Precure of stars, let's choose another element. Hardcatch was bound to get some role in this, and first up we've got Cure Blossom. She's the shy lead of this series and starts off as the weakest Pretty-Cure. Hardcatch was pretty roly-poly in terms of proportions, so she could be animated more comedically than the other characters. She could run nervously across the field and move a little like Sakura from Street Fighter. She'd likely have lower HP and be a little weak. Blossom's first attack would be Pink Forward Wave. However, her second attack would be a status. Using the Red Heart Seed, Cure Blossom could increase her speed and let her put out a few more hits. For her final attack, Blossom calls upon her own team to combine into Infinity Silhouette. With this great power, she launches a single bright punch, just like in the finale. Precure love their trios, and the most common one is Land, Sea, and Sky. We've got Fortune, we've got Blossom, but with so many cures, who gets this last position? I thought long and hard about this one. Pure Beauty was heavily considered, but at the end of the day, I just had to go with Aqua. Maybe it's recency bias because I just finished Just 5, but she's such a fun character. Karen is the student council president and upper-class rich girl. She's incredibly stubborn and has one of the most graceful fights in this franchise. As Cure Aqua, she'd always fight with her Cure Fleurette in sword form. I feel this suits her elegant persona and adds some much-needed sword combat. Cure Aqua's first finisher would summon the White Horse and turn her sword into a giant lance that stabs the opponent while she's running across the screen. Her second finisher would be Sapphire Arrow. Finally, her third attack would be original. She'd plunge her sword into the ground and surround herself in a whirlpool that slowly expands. It would take up more than half the screen. Once you're trapped, you can't escape, but it ends pretty fast. With the trio of elements, let's add a special final member, a sixth ranger if you will. The true princess of flames and the former daughter of despair. Toa is a regal but passionate girl with a desire to become a grand princess. When it comes to this character, I debated on which form to keep, so I kept them both. Pure Scarlet fights with flames and does basic fire punches and kicks. She'd also have a small phoenix summon that could fly across the screen. For her first finisher, she'd summon the Scarlet Violin and perform Phoenix Blaze. Her second finisher would use the Sun Key and perform Scarlet Prominence. Her third and final finisher would transform her into Grand Princess form for a powered-up fire attack. Maybe something like spiral flames that look like phoenix wings. Now, why did I say we're keeping both? Well, if you're at low health, perhaps below half, to keep this viable, pressing the special button will allow you to switch forms, kinda like Zelda and Sheik. Twilight plays like a completely different character. She gets her flame staff from episode 13 that produces blue flames. She can also use the dress-up keys that were designed for the anime. Her first attack shoots out fire beams from top to bottom. Her second finisher uses the fan or peacock key and causes flames to erupt from the center of the screen, kinda like a peacock's plumage. Her third and final finisher would use the butterfly key and transform her into the Black Princess. In this form, she'd flood the entire field with flame, guaranteeing a little bit of damage, even if you try to dodge. With that said, let's move on from one bad princess to another. One of the brattiest villains, Regina was either fun or incredibly annoying to watch. Unlike the show, she'll be taking Cure Ace's position. Regina fights with the Miracle Dragon Glaive as it's incredibly cool, and again, we need more characters with weapons. Regina is a great long-range attacker with her spear, but she can also shoot beams like she does in the anime. Her first finisher lets her blacken the opponent's psyche. Her second finisher would let her summon one of the Selfish Trio, kinda like an assist. This suits her bossy personality and lets them feature in the game. Her third and final attack would be using the glaive's power to shoot dragon-like energy bolts. It could also just be one big bolt. The villain's side still coming up short, so let's keep at it. We've already had a Cure duo, so what about a villain duo? The iconic Daft Punk makes their debut, and they'd primarily use hand-to-hand combat, kinda like in episode 48. They'd be a duo like Black and White and play as such. They work best at close range and are pretty fast. Stop and Freeze's first finisher is a combo of hits as they move toward the foe. Their second would allow them to send converging beams, and their third would let them enter the dragon form they were in for a while. They would reach across the screen and trap the opponent. We've been on a villain binge, so I have just one last entry before we stop. Technically, Julia was a villain, but given his weapon was destroyed in episode 23, he will be fighting on the good side as Cure Waffle, or more canonically, Rio. He would use the candy rod from Lumiere, but transform it into good versions of the weapons he used. Rio would use a sword at all times, but it could also transform. For example, heavy attacks would use the trident, and far attacks would use the bow. His finishers would mix his abilities as a villain, a fairy, and a human. Perhaps he could cycle his rod through all of its forms for the first one, and for the second one he could fly across the screen in fairy form. His third one would draw on his sister's power, giving him his own version of Kirakuru Rainbow. I feel like it would satisfy all the Cure Waffle stands. With those choices made, I think our roster is getting pretty full, so let's have a few of my favorites show up before we wrap this up. Dance in fighting games is such a common trope, we just had to represent it here. I'm choosing to include Cure Peach, because not only is she the dancing Cure, but the CG dance endings debuted in her season. As a result, I'd imagine her pacing back and forth and using lots of dance moves to fight. She'd be a unique character to play and just fun to watch on screen. Apart from this, she'd also have lots of leaps and kicks like in the anime. Her first finisher would use the Cure Stick for Love, Sunshine, Fresh. Her second one would involve Cure Berry and Pine, joining her to perform Triple Fresh. Her final finisher would let her transform into her Cure Angel form, performing Loving True Heart. I was tempted to use the group finisher for this, but I find it more unique to give them their own attacks. Our final entry just for me is Cure Felice. She's one of the most powerful cures in Precure canon, and she's the only character who's been implied to be god level, so why not let her fight with the rest? Cure Felice is pretty strong, so she'd have some close range strikes to balance her. Apart from this, she'd have a few spells picked from her teammates in the show in general. Felicia's first finisher would use the Flower Echo Wand for Emerald Reincarnation, and the second finisher would bring her teammates to her to perform Extreme Rainbow. Finally, her last finisher would let her enter Mother Apapa form and hug the entire world. It's a very fitting, loving kind of attack. Alright, so now we've got a good mix of elemental fighters, hand-to-hand combatants, and a few unconventional picks with unique strategies. Beyond the tiny size of this roster, I truly feel proud of having picked out characters based on their roles and fighting strategy, rather than popularity. I've also avoided the later seasons because the current selection already fills their roles, and the fighters, especially the villains, don't have very interesting combat. 16 is way too small for a fighting game, but I imagine there'd be DLC and updates just to put in more stable characters. Additionally, this is what my mind can come up with right now, and what I would like to see if this were one of the older games when character count wasn't such a big deal. So with that said, let me know who you want to see, and thank you so much for watching. See you guys next time.